All right, we've been given the all clear. It is now 2:50 p.m. So that means that the all lost time is 2 hours, 4:50. So the all lost time is 5:05 p.m. Eastern time.
Wait, Mike, can you say the team numbers again? I'm so sorry.
It is team 41 on the plaintiff, team 38 on defense.
Thank you. So sorry.
All right. And with that, I am now leaving you, and I will leave you in Judge De Palma's capable.
Okay, so we have the all clear to go, and I will call to order the case of Stevie Rogers versus Drew Mars. My name is Judge De Palma. Scoring judges, please look to the 2 buttons on the lower left of your screen. Remember to keep your audio and video muted unless the bailiff tells you otherwise. You should also have your video set to hide all non-video participants. So the only people on the screen should be the advocates and me. Can the attorneys please make appearances?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Bree Goodchild. I'm joined today with my co-counsel, Mr. Riley Weiberg.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Afternoon.
And today we represent the plaintiff, Miss Stevie Rogers, who is present with us in court today as well.
Okay.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, Ms. Rogers. Defense, could you make appearances, please?
Yes. Good afternoon, Judge De Palma. My name is Cabrara, and I, along with my co-counsel, Riley Lee,
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
represent the defendant, Drew Mars, today.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon. Are there any other pretrial things we need to attend to before opening statements?
Yes, Your Honor. We'd like to direct the court's attention to the pretrial ruling by the Honorable Page. Now, there are a few matters that have already been decided before this trial has started. Specifically, Rule 615 has already been invoked, and it's already been pre-established that both Ms. Rogers and Mr. Mars will be present in today's courtroom.
That's fine.
Beyond that, we would also like to take notice that Exhibits 1 through 7 are pre-admitted in today's case and have already been established to be used at any point in trial without laying more foundation.
Mr. Rosati, is that your understanding as well?
That is, yes.
Okay.
Finally, Your Honor, the lead detective in today's investigation, Detective Khan, is unavailable to testify. Now, it's already been ruled by Honorable Page that because of this, Investigator Bond, who worked with her on the investigation, is allowed to testify to the context of her investigative report, which is Exhibit 6, which has already been pre-admitted into evidence as well.
And Mr. Rosati, is that your understanding of the pretrial ruling?
It is, Judge.
Okay.
And with that, Your Honor, the plaintiff is ready to proceed with opening statements.
Any pretrial matters from the defense?
Yeah, just one, Your Honor.
Okay.
After a sustained objection, since it's the first time in your courtroom, we'd like to ask whether you'd like us to move to strike or assume that the testimony's been stricken.
You can assume it's been stricken.
Great. Thank you, Your Honor. And with that, we're ready to proceed.
Perfect. Then we will now hear opening statements from each party. Everyone should make sure they are in speaker view. The button is on the upper right hand of your screen. Attorneys, please remember to mute your audio when the other attorney is speaking. And Mr. Weiberg, you may proceed whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury. Today you're going to hear the story of Agatha Lee, the famous author who wrote the mystery novel Death in a Bottle, an 82-year-old woman who lived right here in the state of Midlands. That was until August 15th of 2018 when she was found in her room, dead and alone. Now, members of the jury, today you're not going to hear that Miss Lee died of natural causes. Today you're going to hear that she was poisoned by an individual who was out of time and out of money. The defendant, Drew Mars. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, today you're going to hear that Mr. Mars, in that same year that Miss Lee passed away, was named her sole heir. A title that would net them $20 million if Miss Lee was to pass away. But members of the jury, today you're going to hear that for Mr. Mars, well, the clock was ticking. See, Mr. Mars had a sibling who was very sick. And the defendant didn't have enough money to afford their treatment. They didn't know if their sibling was going to make it longer than Miss Lee would. But members of the jury, today you're going to hear that for the defendant, well, that clock, it started to tick a little faster. Because on August 14th, they overheard a conversation between Miss Agatha Lee and her granddaughter, Stevie Rogers. And during this conversation, Miss Rogers was told that she was going to be named the sole heir. And Mr. Mars, well, in a couple of days, he was going to be removed from that will. Members of the jury, in a couple of days for the defendant, that $20 million, it was going to slip through his fingers. That money he needed to take care of his sibling, just a couple of days, was going to disappear. And after he heard this conversation, the defendant took some time to collect his thoughts and put a plan into action. They went to the pharmacy and purchased a medication known as chloroandramine. Now, members of the jury, today you're going to hear that chloroandramine looks identical to the arthritis medication that Miss Lee was taking. In addition to this medication, well, Miss Lee was deathly allergic to it. And after buying this medication in the morning, the defendant waited until the night when they snuck into the victim's room and switched their medication because they were out of time and out of options. Members of the jury, this is what brings us to court today. We're here to answer a simple question. Was Mr. Mars responsible for the death of Miss Lee? But there's an important clarification to make, members of the jury, because today's case, it's not a murder case. Today, the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers, is bringing forth a lawsuit against Mr. Mars. And this lawsuit is being placed under the Slayer statute that states if an individual is responsible for another individual's death, well, they can't receive any of their estate. Meaning at the end of today's case, if you side with the plaintiff, well, Mr. Mars is not going to receive any of that inheritance. Now, in today's case, the plaintiff has a burden of proof. We must show by the preponderance of evidence that the defendant was responsible for the death of Miss Lee. Now, this means that we must show that it was more likely than not that on July 14th, the defendant took action that led to Miss Lee's death. And members of the jury, today we're going to show you this by showing you that the defendant had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. Because in today's case, the defendant's going to take that stand. They're going to take an oath, and they're going to look you right in the eyes. And when he does, the defendant's going to tell you he knew that chloroandramine looked identical to Miss Lee's arthritis medication. He knew the victim was deathly allergic to chloroandramine. And he knew exactly where the victim kept her medicine and which medication she took on which day. Now, members of the jury, you're also going to hear from the defendant. And he's going to tell you that after he heard the conversation between Miss Rogers and Miss Lee about her will, well, they went right to the pharmacy. And despite what the defense is going to come before you and say, you're going to hear exactly what he bought. Because when his room was searched, after Miss Lee's body was found, they found something in his closet. They found a black bag with his fingerprint on it and a bottle of chloroandramine. Members of the jury, the defendant's going to tell you he loved his family. And members of the jury, love isn't a crime. But when the defendant was faced with the decision between his family's life and Miss Lee's life, he chose family because he was out of time and out of options. And that's why at the end of today's case, my co-counsel Bree Goodchild's going to come before you And she's going to ask you to hold the defendant accountable and find in favor of the plaintiff. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weiberg. Does the defense have an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed? Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. Now, Mr. Weiberg just came before you and told you that it was Drew Mars who killed Agatha Lee, that it was Drew Mars who switched her Winterin pills for chlorandramine. But in today's case, I want you to pay special attention to evidence that seems too easy, too straightforward. Because when you take a harder look, you'll see that it was Drew Mars who was framed for fortune. Now let's start at the beginning. Back in 2008, Drew Mars was a nursing student at a local college. He responded to an ad in a newspaper looking for a full-time live-in caretaker for an elderly woman named Miss Agatha Lee. Drew Mars applied for and received that job and started working for Miss Lee full-time upon graduation. In 2011, Drew Mars followed Miss Lee all the way here to Midland, where he continued living as a full-time caretaker. Now, at first, the relationship was that of any other nurse or patient. But the defendant lived with Miss Lee for 10 years. And during those 10 years, they became friends. They started watching movies together, sharing stories. They became more like grandson and grandmother and less like employer and employee. And eventually, Miss Lee started opening up about her family. Miss Lee told Drew Mars about her granddaughter, Stevie Rogers. She said that Stevie Rogers, when she was younger, well, they'd been close. But she hadn't heard from Stevie in over 6 years. Drew Mars was the only family that Miss Lee had left. And that's why in February of 2018, Miss Lee left the entirety of her $20 million estate to Drew Mars. See, members of the jury, Miss Lee, she wasn't an ordinary person. She was the sole owner of a $20 million estate. She was one of America's best-selling novelists. Now, it had been Stevie Rogers who was the original beneficiary of that $20 million estate. And when Stevie Rogers found out she had been disinherited, she was furious. That's why Miss Rogers showed up to Miss Lee's doorstep in July of 2018 to convince her grandmother to allow her back in the will. And finally, after a month had passed on August 14, 2018, Miss Rogers approached her grandmother and asked to be put back in the will. Miss Lee refused. You'll hear today from Ryan Cabrara, an autobiographer who met with Miss Lee that day, who will tell you just how upset Stevie was and how disappointed Miss Lee was for disappointing her granddaughter, but that she was confident she had made the right decision. After Miss Rogers had found out she had been disinherited, she knew she needed to come up with a plan. She knew she needed to find a way to make sure that $20 million, well, that would go to her. You see, members of the jury, Miss Rogers was a former law student. She was well aware of the Slayer statute. Now, the Slayer statute means that if you're found civilly liable for causing someone's death, you can inherit their estate. Miss Rogers knew that if she could frame Drew Mars for the murder of her grandmother, she would receive that $20 million estate. Miss Rogers also knew about Miss Lee's allergy to chlorandramine. She also knew that chlorandramine was identical in size, shape, and color to Winterin, Miss Lee's arthritis medication. All she had to do now was switch those two pills. On August 14, 2018, Miss Rogers slipped into the bedroom of her grandmother and swapped her Winterin pills for chlorandramine. She then planted a black bag into Drew Mars' closet containing that bottle of chlorandramine pills. All she had to do now was wait. The next morning, Miss Lee was found unresponsive in her room, having died from a fatal allergic reaction to chlorandramine. Now, as the defense in today's case, we bear no burden of proof. It's the plaintiff who must show you it is more likely than not that it was Drew Mars who caused the death of Agatha Lee. They will not be able to meet their burden. It was Drew Mars who was framed for fortune. And at the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Cabrara will come before you and ask that you find Drew Mars not liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lee. Now, before the plaintiff calls its first witness, I'll ask everyone to switch to gallery view. That button's in the upper right of your screen, and that'll allow you to see the attorneys and witness at the same time. We'll give everyone a second to do that. Mr. Weiberg, is the plaintiff ready to call its first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Plaintiff calls Stevie Rogers to the stand.
Okay. And you can proceed whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Would you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Hi, I'm Stevie Rogers.
Ms. Rogers, what brings you to court today?
I'm here to seek justice for my grandmother. She didn't deserve this fate, and she should be here with me right now.
Ms. Rogers, would you mind explaining to the members of the jury who your grandmother is?
The one and only Agatha Lee. She was the famous author who wrote Death in a Bottle, and you probably know of her.
What was your relationship like with your grandmother?
I was extremely close with her as a kid, and she was always there for me. We would always spend time at her house playing games, and she always used to make fun of me when she would beat me at backgammon. And she was there when I lost both of my parents.
Ms. Rogers, did you spend a lot of time with your grandmother?
I spent as much time as I could with her. I used to visit her as often as I could when I was younger, but when I got older, life seemed to get in the way and I didn't see her as often.
I want to be specific for the members of the jury. What do you mean by you didn't see her that often?
I guess I never really got over my parents' death. And that took a toll on me, and I had to drop out of law school because the pressure just got too much. So I took some time traveling to find myself again, and I even wrote some novels just like her.
Ms. Rogers, while you were traveling, how long did you go without seeing your grandmother?
I traveled for about 7 years, and during that time, I didn't see her at all.
Did this affect your relationship?
Never. Although I didn't see her as frequently, she would always be the only one who was there for me. And she would send me letters all the time. We were family, and nothing could have ever changed that.
Ms. Rogers, when did you see your grandmother again?
It was in the summer of 2018, on the 4th of July.
And why did you decide to come back in the summer of 2018?
I needed to see my family again. It was the 10th anniversary of my parents' death, and I needed my Nana.
When you returned to your grandmother's home, how did she react?
I was welcomed with open arms, and it was like I never left. Nana realized that I needed a place to stay because I was away for so long, so she told me I could stay for as long as I wanted.
How was your relationship when you returned?
Absolutely nothing had changed. We talked all the time, and I made her breakfast every morning.
Ms. Rogers, I want to move on and talk about your grandmother's will. Do you know who's supposed to be her original inheritor?
I do. I was the sole beneficiary once my parents died.
Do you know if this ever changed?
She wrote me a letter while I was traveling, and it stated that she was removing me as her sole heir.
Do you know who she was naming her sole heir?
I do. In the letter, she told me she was planning on changing it to Drew Mars, her personal caretaker.
Ms. Rogers, I want to take a moment to talk about Drew Mars. When you returned to Lee Manor, how did the defendant treat you?
I always felt she was threatened by me. She would eavesdrop or interrupt my conversations with Nana, and she would always ask me when I would be leaving. It felt weird to me.
Ms. Rogers, when you returned to Lee Manor, did your grandmother ever bring up the topic of her will?
She did.
When was this?
This was on the 14th of July, I believe.
And when she brought up this will, before we talk about the contents of this conversation, I want to make some things clear for the members of the jury. From the time that you returned to Lee Manor, did you ever ask your grandmother about her inheritance?
Never.
From the time you were disinherited, did you ever ask her about her will?
Not even once.
After you were disinherited, did you even ask her for money?
No, our relationship was more than just that.
And when your grandmother brought up your will, what exactly did she say?
She told me she was going to meet with a lawyer and switch the will back over to me.
When your grandmother told you that she was switching the will, what was her demeanor like?
It was quite emotional. We were both crying. She kept telling me how she was happy and how happy she had been since I returned.
Ms. Rogers, what did you two do after you had this conversation?
We hugged, and as I was leaving, I opened the door and Drew Mars was standing directly in front of the door.
Ms. Rogers, I want to talk about your interaction with Mr. Mars. When you left the room, what did the defendant look like?
He looked angry. He was red in the face and his fists were clenched.
Did the defendant say anything to you?
He just shook his head and mouthed "no way" at me.
Ms. Rogers, I want to shift our attention to the following day, August 15th. How did that morning start?
It started the same as usual. I went downstairs. I had made her a regular breakfast and we were just talking.
Ms. Rogers, I want to ask you a couple final questions. Have you ever heard of the drug Winterin?
I have, yes.
Do you know what it looks like?
Not particularly. Maybe I just knew she had a bunch of pills.
No further questions.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Ms. Rogers, back in 2008, you got access to a trust fund, didn't you?
The money my parents left me when they died, yes.
That trust fund had about $2 million in it, didn't it?
Yes, it did.
And you claimed on direct examination that you saw your grandmother as much as you possibly could, right?
When I was younger, I did, yes.
You said that you and your grandmother remained close, right?
I always felt like our relationship was strong, yes.
But it's true, isn't it, that from 2011 to 2018, you didn't visit your grandmother once, right?
No, I didn't.
During those 8 years, you didn't have any financial problems, did you?
Not to my knowledge, no.
You didn't need to ask your grandmother for any money, right?
No, I never felt like she was just money to me.
Well, your trust fund still had money in it during that time, right?
I did have a few $1,000s, yes.
Then in June of 2018, that $2 million trust fund ran out, right?
It was getting lower and lower, it kept diminishing, yes.
And in June of 2018, it had completely run out. Isn't that right?
I had a few $1,000s left after I hired the private investigator.
Is it your testimony here today that your trust fund still had money in it during June of 2018?
No, I just knew I had some money left besides the trust fund.
But to be clear, the trust fund had run out.
Yes.
And at that time, you didn't have a job, did you?
No, I didn't.
You had no way of making money, right?
I could pick up odd jobs here and there, but nothing.
And that just a few months before your trust fund had run out, your grandmother had disinherited you from her will, right?
I received a letter from her stating so, yes.
So just 1 month after your trust fund ran out, you showed up at your grandmother's house for the first time in 8 years. Do I have that correct?
Yes, but I went there because of my parents' anniversary.
That's a yes to my question, Ms. Rogers.
Yes.
In fact, you hadn't talked to your grandmother in so long that you needed to hire a private detective to figure out where she lived. Isn't that right?
I hired the private investigator.
You hired the private investigator because you hadn't talked to your grandmother in so long, you didn't even know where she lived. Is that accurate?
I didn't know where she lived because there was no return address on the letters. I kept feeling like she was playing with me sometimes, but yes.
Ms. Rogers, I'd like to shift your attention to while you were living at Lee Manor. Now, on August 14th, you had a conversation with your grandmother about her will, right?
Yes, I did.
After only living there for about a month, correct?
I would say so, yes.
Now, you said on direct examination that your grandmother told you she'd be including you in the will at that time, right?
That's what she said.
But there was no lawyer present during that conversation?
No, it was just a private conversation with me and my Nana.
No one else was in the room to confirm that's actually what was said, right?
No, it was just the two of us.
And the entire time you lived at Lee Manor, you were never actually in the will, right?
No, but that wasn't my concern.
Well, I'd like to talk to you about something called the Slayer Statute. The Slayer Statute essentially means you can't receive the inheritance of someone if you're responsible for their death. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Now, that was something you were familiar with before your grandmother died, right?
Yeah, I'd heard about it in law school before I dropped out.
It's something you're very familiar with, right?
I did well in my wills class, so yes.
And so in your circumstance, that meant two things needed to happen for the Slayer Statute to come into effect. Your grandmother had to die, and Drew Mars had to be shown to be the killer. Isn't that right? From what you understand?
Your Honor, compound question.
I can pick it up, Your Honor. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine.
So in your circumstance, two things had to happen. Your grandmother had to die, right?
Yes.
And Drew Mars had to be shown to be the killer. Isn't that right?
Yes, but I'm a bit confused.
But, well, Miss Rogers, the way you understand it, if that were to be true, you would then receive the full inheritance. Isn't that right?
If that were to happen, yes.
And let's talk about what you knew and what you didn't know about Mr. Mars. You knew that Mr. Mars was the one who handled Miss Lee's medication, right?
Yes, that was Nana's caretaker.
You knew that Miss Lee was allergic to something called chloroandramine?
Yes, Mr. Mars had told me about it randomly.
You knew that just one pill of chloroandramine could kill your grandmother, right?
That's what Drew said.
You knew where your grandmother kept her pill organizer, right?
Beside her bedside table?
So that's a yes, you knew where it was?
Yes.
And on the day that she died, you were home alone for several hours. Is that true?
Nana and Mars went to lunch, so yes.
So there's no one else in the house for a few hours.
They just left me there and I spent the time trying to finish off my novels.
You knew where your grandmother's room was in the house, right?
I did, yes.
Then you also knew where Mr. Mars's room was in the house, right?
I did.
To the best of your knowledge, there were no locks on Mr. Mars's door or your grandmother's door, right?
No, but I never felt the need to go into Mars's room.
But it's true that to the best of your knowledge, there was nothing stopping you from entering those rooms, right?
Yes.
Now, Ms. Rogers, I'd like to talk to you about the next day when your grandmother was found dead. You were the first person to call it a murder, isn't that right?
Yes, that was me.
When the police arrived, you insisted that they photograph your grandmother's pill organizer, right?
Yes.
When the police arrived, you insisted that it was Drew Mars who was responsible, isn't that right?
I did.
When the police arrived, you insisted that they run a toxicology screen, am I correct?
Yes, I did. Nana was perfectly healthy the day before.
Well, you actually predicted what that toxicology screen would show before your grandmother was killed, right?
I knew something wasn't right.
Well, you knew that that toxicology screen would show that your grandmother was poisoned with chloroangemine, didn't you?
I did.
In fact, you were so sure that that was her cause of death, you filed this lawsuit against Mr. Mars before the results of the tox screen even came back. Is that right, Ms. Rogers?
Yes.
Thank you, Ms. Rogers. No further questions, Your Honor.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Ms. Rogers, you were asked a lot of questions about your grandmother's medication. I just want to ask you, who was in control of what medication she was taking?
Drew Mars. I had absolutely nothing to do with her medicine.
Who told you that your grandmother was allergic to chloroangemine?
Drew Mars, and he volunteered that information.
Who told you that it would take just one pill for your grandmother to die of chloroangemine?
Mr. Mars.
Nothing further.
Any recross?
Briefly, Your Honor.
Okay.
Ms. Rogers, Mr. Weiberg just asked you a lot about the information you had about chloroangemine. To be clear, you were aware of all of that information before your grandmother died. Isn't that right?
Yes.
Nothing further.
Anything further based on that, Mr. Weiberg?
No, I ask that Ms. Rogers be excused.
You may step down, Ms. Rogers.
Thank you.
A quick reminder to scoring judges to make sure we score as we go. And is the plaintiff ready to call their next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Investigator Bond to the stand.
Okay. You may proceed whenever you're ready.
Good afternoon, sir. Would you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Afternoon, miss. Name is Montgomery Bond.
Can you tell us what you do for a living?
Well, I'm an investigator, one of the private persuasion.
What do you do as an investigator?
Generally speaking, can work in conjunction with the government, local and federal, on a carcutterie of cases, interviewing witnesses, following leads, and collecting evidence.
What kind of experience do you have as an investigator?
I've been working as a private investigator for 20 years now. It's led me to all sorts of folks. I've worked on murders, kidnappings, cases of fraud, you name it.
Can you tell us how you're involved in this case?
Yes, I received a call the morning of August 15th from Miss Stevie Rogers, telling me that her grandmother had been murdered.
So how did you become involved?
Well, she asked me if I would come by and take a look at it. So I headed over there, got there a little bit before noon and started asking some questions.
Sir, did you work with anyone else on this investigation?
I did, yes. As I mentioned, generally I work in conjunction with the government, so a Detective Khan from the Midlands Police Department showed up a few minutes after I arrived there, and we took on the case in a dual detective capacity.
Well, Mr. Bond, I want to direct your attention to the death of Agatha Lee. During your investigation, did you take any steps to determine a cause of death?
Yes. A few days later, after Agatha's body was found, she went in for an autopsy and a toxicology screening at the Midlands Medical Examiner's office.
Did you get these results back?
We did. It showed that Agatha Lee had not died of natural causes. In fact, she died of an allergic reaction to two 250 milligram chloroandramine pills.
Well, sir, what is chloroandramine?
Well, chloroandramine is typically a heartburn medication, and for most people that wouldn't be harmless at all. But for a small fraction of the population, some people are incredibly allergic to it.
Was Agatha Lee allergic to this heartburn medication?
Yes, we found out from the autopsy that Agatha Lee had suffered a heart attack a couple of years ago from taking chloroandramine.
Well, sir, once you found that there was chloroandramine in her system, how did that influence your investigation?
Well, after that, we started to ask the question of how could she have consumed the chloroandramine when she knew that she was allergic to it. So we got a warrant and we started searching the house to see if there were any clues that could lead us to that answer.
Well, did you find any?
Oh, we did. We found a bunch of bottles in the house of different sorts of pills, and we sent that into the medical examiner's office to have screenings taken on.
Did the office find that any of these medications were chloroandramine?
They did. There was one bottle of chloroandramine found at Lee Manor.
Where was the chloroandramine found?
Well, the one bottle of chloroandramine was found in a black bag in one closet in the room of one Mr. Drew Mars in Lee Manor.
Sir, after you found a bottle of chloroandramine in the defendant's bedroom, what did you do next in your investigation?
Well, we went through and we started to take some forensic evidence from the bag itself. We sent it in to get a screening for fingerprints, and we were able to lift one usable fingerprint off of that bag zipper.
What did that print show?
It showed that the only recoverable fingerprint was that of one Mr. Drew Mars, right on the zipper.
Mr. Bond, I'd like to shift gears and talk a bit more about what happened after Agatha Lee died. Now, were you present for a will reading for Miss Lee?
I was. Several days after her passing, a Kirby Doolittle came by to read her will.
To be clear, sir, who is Kirby Doolittle?
Oh, yes, that is Miss Lee's attorney. He came with the will and he read it out to me, Detective Khan, Mr. Mars, and Stevie Rogers.
What were the terms of the will?
Well, it said that the entire estate of Miss Lee was to go to the caretaker, Mr. Mars.
How did the defendant respond to this news?
Well, he jumped right out of his chair, screamed, "I can't believe it," and just darted right out the door. It was something else, and I almost believed it.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I would have believed it, but I had seen some evidence to the contrary that Mr. Mars had actually known before that he was going to receive that inheritance.
Let's talk a bit more about that. Mr. Weiberg, if you'd please put Exhibit 13 on the screen. Can you identify this document, sir?
Yes, this is a picture of an email I took from Mr. Mars' computer, one from Mr. Mars to a friend.
Does it appear to be in the same condition as the last time you saw it?
It appears to be, yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the plaintiff offers Exhibit 13 into evidence.
Any objection from the defense?
No objection, Your Honor.
Okay, Exhibit 13 will be admitted.
Mr. Bond, how did this email help your investigation?
Well, the email in it says that Drew Mars says that Agatha just told me she changed her will to leave everything to me. And now this email, it's important to note that it's from February 7th of 2018. That's 6 months before Miss Lee's will was read.
Thank you for your time, Mr. Bond. Your Honor, at this time, I have no further questions.
Okay, cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. So Detective Bond, I want to talk a little bit about what you saw and what you didn't see. You didn't see Stevie Rogers on August 14th, 2018, right?
That is correct. I was not at Lee Manor on the 14th, only on the 15th and several days after that.
That's right. You didn't see Drew Mars on August 14th or Miss Agatha Lee, right?
No, like I said, I was not at Lee Manor on the 14th.
And you can't tell us anything about Drew Mars, his relationship with Miss Agatha Lee, isn't that right?
No, I would not be able to tell you the nature of their relationship.
But you do know that there was no evidence that Drew Mars had ever purchased chlorangiamine, right?
That is correct. We went to several pharmacies near the house. We know that Mr. Mars on the 14th stopped at a pharmacy, but he paid in cash, so there was no receipt.
Mr. Bond, I'm not asking you to speculate as to whether or not Mr. Mars paid in cash. I'm just asking that you are aware there is no evidence that Drew Mars ever purchased chlorangiamine. Isn't that right?
No, there is no receipt stating that Drew Mars purchased chlorangiamine.
No video evidence as well, such as surveillance?
No such video evidence.
No online record of Drew Mars purchasing chlorangiamine?
No online record of that.
And Mr. Bond, you can't tell us whether or not that black bag had been planted in Mr. Mars' closet. Isn't that right?
I can't tell you for certain that it had been planted, but I highly doubt that. The only print that was usable on it was Mr. Mars' print.
Mr. Bond, I'm not asking you to speculate, just yes or no. You can't tell us whether or not that bag had been planted in Drew Mars' closet since you weren't there. Isn't that right?
I cannot tell you to 100-degree certainty, no.
So, Mr. Bond, I want to mention something. I want to talk about something you mentioned on direct examination. You said that Stevie Rogers had called you and said that her grandmother had been murdered, right?
Well, that's what she told me, yes.
But that was before there had been a toxicology report. Is that right?
That is correct.
There had been an autopsy.
That is also correct.
So at that point in time, you'd agree with me that the only information available was that an 82-year-old woman had died in her sleep. Isn't that right?
Yes, the only information was that a perfectly healthy woman had died.
And finally, Mr. Bond, I want to talk about your employer. Now, I understand that you do work in conjunction with the Midlands Police Department, but you're not employed by the Midlands Police Department. Isn't that right?
No, I am not.
You haven't received any formal police training?
No formal police training, just 20 years of private investigative work working in conjunction with police.
No, sorry, Mr. Bond, you're a detective for hire, right?
That is correct. That's what us private investigators do.
And you were hired by the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers. Isn't that right?
That is correct. She asked me to come by and help out with the Midlands Police.
You're also receiving $25,000 from the plaintiff, right?
That is correct. As a private investigator, I get paid for my work. I've been working on this for several years now, since Agatha passed in 2018.
Thank you, Mr. Bond. Nothing further.
Any redirect?
None, Your Honor. We just ask that Mr. Bond be excused.
Mr. Bond, you are excused. Are there any further witnesses from the plaintiff?
No, Your Honor. This time the plaintiff rests our case in chief and would request a 5-minute recess before defense case in chief.
Perfect. We will take a 5-minute recess, which I guess that time will be different for you depending on your time zone. Just everyone remember that this video is being publicly broadcast via YouTube even during the breaks. So we'll come back in 5 minutes.
Okay, I'm sending you to breakout rooms. Okay, I guess we can get back started. Let me close the breakout rooms here. Scoring judges, if you can just either briefly turn your video on or send me a message in chat that you're here. Judge Walker here.
Yes.
Okay, I think we're good to go.
Okay, and we are ready to move on to the defense case in chief. Is the defense ready to call their first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Drew Mars.
Mr. Mars and Ms. Lee, you can start whenever you're ready.
Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hello, I'm Drew Mars.
And what do you do for a living, Mr. Mars?
Currently, I'm not really working, but my previous job, and I mean, really the only job I've ever had, was the in-home caretaker of Agatha Lee.
How long did you work for Miss Lee as a caretaker?
It was like 10 years, from 2008 to 2018. I started working for her when I was in college, getting my nursing degree, and being with her so much, we grew close. She was like a grandmother to me.
How did you start working for Miss Lee?
Before Midlands, Agatha and I, we both lived in Monroeville, Alabama. And in a small town like that, there's not really frequent openings for nursing positions. And I'm a bit of an introvert myself. So when I saw the position for an in-home caretaker, I just jumped on the opportunity.
What was your relationship like with Miss Lee when you first started working with her?
When I first started, it was just work. I would drive her around, cook for her, clean for her, give her her medication. I gave Agatha her space and she gave me mine.
Did the nature of that relationship ever change?
It did. We started spending time together more, and it wasn't just me cooking for her, cleaning. We'd start watching movies or going on walks, reading books. We grew really close. Like I said, we were like family, and I always looked up to Agatha.
Would you say that you were close with Miss Lee right before she died?
Yeah, of course. I mean, 10 years together, like I said, we were like family. And like I said, I always looked up to her and admired her.
How would you say that?
Well, the reason Agatha needed an in-home caretaker is because she had a heart attack. I mean, anyone having a heart attack at any age could be devastating, but Agatha, she made a full recovery, like 110%. I always looked up to her for that.
Do you know what caused Miss Lee's heart attack?
Yeah, Agatha has this allergy to chloroandramine. It's this over-the-counter heartburn medication. She'd accidentally taken a dose, and that's what led to her heart attack.
Mr. Mars, you mentioned before that you administered Miss Lee her medication. Do you know what she took?
Yeah, she took every day 1 pill of vitamin B, 1 aspirin, and 2 Winterin pills. They're these arthritis medication.
What do Winterin pills look like?
Well, they're small, round, and purple, and they have no smell or taste. They actually look identical to chloroandramine, which was concerning.
Why was that concerning?
Well, being that Agatha could literally not tell the difference between the two, I had to be extra careful that no one ever brought that into the house.
So how exactly did you administer Miss Lee her medications every day?
That was pretty simple. Every Saturday I would take her pill divider and I just put the pills in for the week, and then I put it on her bedside table, and then she just takes the pills herself before bed each night.
So, Mr. Mars, I want to talk a little bit more about you and Miss Lee. Did you two live alone?
Yeah, we did until I think it was July 4th of 2018 when Stevie Rogers moved in with us.
Stevie Rogers.
Stevie is Agatha's only grandchild.
Had you met Ms. Rogers before July of 2018?
I did, yeah. When I first started working for Agatha, Stevie came around a lot. You know, those two were attached at the hip, but it didn't stay that way.
What do you mean by that?
Well, around 2010 or 2011, Stevie stopped coming around, and from what I know, stopped answering Agatha's calls and emails. It was kind of weird to see them grow apart like that, being so close once. And I kind of started to wonder, would Agatha ever see Stevie again?
Do you know why Ms. Rogers came to visit after all those years apart?
Well, Agatha told me that Stevie had just gotten out of rehab and needed a place to stay. So I set up a room, and that was that. Stevie was there living with us.
Objection, Your Honor, as to hearsay.
A response?
Again, Your Honor, I asked opposing counsel to clarify which statement exactly she's referring to.
Certainly. Your Honor, the statement that the reason that Ms. Rogers came to visit because she had gotten out of rehab and needed a place to stay, in this context is being used for the truth of the matter asserted, that is in fact the reason for Ms. Rogers coming back. Under 802, this is inadmissible testimony.
Okay, Ms. Lee, a response?
Yes, Your Honor, in this context, we are not using the statement to the truth of the matter. It's already been well established that Stevie Rogers did come to live with Ms. Lee and Mr. Rogers. We're not interested as to whether or not Ms. Rogers was in rehab at the time, just that Mr. Mars was aware at this time that Stevie Rogers was coming to live with them.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
We certainly have no objection to the fact that Ms. Rogers came back. That wasn't the objection. When they said the specific motivations for why she returned, that is the statement we have issue with, and that is being used for the truth of the matter asserted.
Ms. Lee, if you are not using that statement for the truth of the matter asserted, what are you using the specific statement that she came because she had just gotten out of rehab for?
Your Honor, again, we're just using it for the effect on the listener, Drew Mars, that he was aware that Stevie Rogers was coming to live with them.
Okay, I'm going to sustain the objection.
Your Honor, specifically the statement about Stevie Rogers returning from rehab.
Yes, that's correct.
So, Mr. Mars, did you and Ms. Rogers spend a lot of time together?
Oh, not really. I mean, we weren't friends or anything. I just tried to stay out of her way and do my job.
How did Ms. Lee respond to Ms. Rogers moving back in?
Agatha seemed excited about it. You know, they started spending time together again. And I mean, she just seemed genuinely happy.
Did the nature of that relationship ever change?
Yeah, it did. The day before Agatha passed, August 14th, I overheard the two of them talking in Agatha's study when I was bringing Agatha her tea.
What did you hear?
Stevie asked Agatha to put her back in the will.
How did Agatha respond?
Agatha said no. She said something about wanting Stevie to stand up on her own 2 feet.
Did Stevie respond?
No. She just kind of stormed out of the room.
Did she mention anything to you?
She looked at me and she said one thing. She said, "Don't count your millions just yet."
Mr. Mars, what happened that afternoon?
Well, after that went down, I brought Agatha to this local cafe. She was meeting Ryan Cabrara, this autobiographer that they'd been meeting a lot. She was writing a book on Agatha. And after I dropped her off, I just ran some errands.
Do you know where Ms. Rogers was while you were out with Ms. Lee?
No. The last I saw her, she was at the house, but I wasn't with her all that afternoon, so I have no clue.
What happened when you arrived back home?
I just washed up and then I started making dinner for Stevie and Agatha. And then around 6:30, I brought it to them in Agatha's study.
What did you do next?
I just cleaned the kitchen and then I went up to my room and just did some reading, and I fell asleep around 9:30 and I didn't wake up again that night.
Mr. Myers, what did you do the morning of August 15th, 2018?
Well, I woke up at 7 like I usually do, and I went outside to take a walk and then came in to make Agatha her morning coffee. And then I brought it to her room.
When you got to Miss Lee's bedroom, what'd you find?
You know, I knocked on the door to let her know I was coming in, and then I set the coffee on her bedside table, and that's when I noticed that Agatha wasn't moving. And so I tried to wake her up, and I even shook her, but she just didn't wake up.
What'd you do next?
I just ran to Stevie's room and pounded on her door until she came out. And then the two of us, we ran back in. And I was just in shock at that point. I didn't know what was going on.
What happened after you told Miss Rogers about what had happened?
I think she called the police, and then they arrived, and so did this detective, a private detective. And I don't know, at that point, I just felt like I was in shock.
Do you know how Miss Agatha Lee died?
Yeah, it was chloroandramine. She had taken chloroandramine. I don't know how it got into the house, but I'm supposed to be her caretaker, and I let the one thing that she was allergic to come into the house.
Mr. Mars, I want to give you a chance to address the plaintiff's allegations directly. Did you provide Miss Agatha Lee with chloroandramine pills?
No, I would never do that to her.
Thank you, Mr. Mars. Nothing further.
Cross-examination?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Mars.
Good afternoon.
Now, I want to first start by talking a bit more about chloroandramine. Now,
Okay.
you'd agree with me that this is a heartburn medication.
Yeah, it's an over-the-counter heartburn medication.
Since it's over the counter, you don't need a prescription to get it.
No, literally anyone could buy it.
You can just walk into a pharmacy and walk out with a bottle of it.
Right, you don't need to be a doctor, a registered nurse, just anyone could buy it.
And sir, you'd agree with me that you went to a pharmacy on August 14th.
Yeah, I did. That's where I was running my errands.
You went to the pharmacy around noon?
I think so. It was right after I dropped Agatha off to meet with Ryan Cabrara.
It was also after you heard Miss Rogers and her grandmother talking in the study that day.
Yeah, when I heard them talking about the will.
Mr. Mars, I'd like to turn your attention and talk a bit about your financial situation.
Okay.
Now, you'd agree with me that you did quite a bit of financial supporting for your family back home.
Yeah, we have a big family, and I never came from wealth, so I was pretty set up with Agatha, and I didn't need all the money she gave me, so I sent a lot of it back home.
You helped pay for their rent,
Yes.
their medical expenses,
Yeah.
their food.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you provided this support for your parents.
That's right. My whole family. Agatha paid me more than enough, more than I needed, so I sent it back to them.
You sent it back to your grandparents too,
Yes,
even your siblings.
that's right. Yeah.
Now, one of your siblings, your brother Keen, well, he was pretty sick.
Yeah, he was around that time.
He'd been diagnosed with brittle bone disease.
That's right. It was really tragic.
And you did your best to help pay for those medical expenses.
Yeah, I did, like I always would.
But your brother started to need more treatments.
That's right. Yeah,
The bills started to pile up.
that's right.
You'd agree with me that in 2018, your family needed more money than you could provide.
That's correct. Yes.
But once Agatha told you she'd give you her inheritance, you had some hope.
Yeah, I mean, with that money, you never need money again.
With that kind of money, you could take care of your sibling.
Yes, that's true.
But you were worried you were running out of time.
Oh yeah, brittle bones disease is pretty tragic and hard to deal with, so I did fear I was running out of time.
You were worried that your sibling might die before you had the money to take care of him.
Yeah, that's true.
Mr. Mars, I'd like to turn your attention to the will reading where they announced Agatha Lee's estate. Now,
Okay.
you attended this reading, right?
Yes, I did.
There was also Detective Kahn there that day.
Yes, Detective Kahn and Minstrel Bond, I think, was there too, or Montgomery Bond. So was the lawyer and Ryan Cabrara.
Now, the lawyer read out Miss Lee's estate, right?
Yes, that's correct.
They announced that you would receive everything.
That's right.
And once you heard this, You said you had no idea.
Yeah, I did say that.
To be fair, sir, that was a lie.
It was. I shouldn't have said that. I should have just been truthful from the start.
You learned that you'd receive her will back in February of 2018,
That's true. That's when Agatha told me.
but you lied to the police in August.
Oh, yes, I just pretended, and I know I shouldn't have.
I want to talk about why you did that. Now, one of the reasons you lied to the police that day is because you didn't want them to think you had a motive to commit this crime.
Yes, that's true.
You didn't want the police to investigate you.
Well, I didn't care if they investigated because I didn't do anything, but I just didn't want all this going down.
Sir, you'd agree with me that you lied to the police so you wouldn't be considered a suspect.
That's true.
Thank you for your time, sir. I have nothing further, Your Honor.
Okay, any redirect?
Just briefly, Your Honor. Mr. Mars, have you ever bought chlorandramine?
No, never in my life.
Have you ever brought chlorandramine into Lee Manor?
Absolutely not. That was the one
Have
thing
you-
I tried to stop.
Have you ever harmed Miss Lee in any way?
No, I would never do that, like I said.
Thank you, Mr. Mars. I have nothing further.
Any recross?
None, Your Honor.
Okay, Mr. Mars, you may step down.
Thank you.
Is the defense ready to call their next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. The defense calls Ms. Cabrara to the stand.
Okay, Ms. Cabrera and Mr. Rosati, you may begin whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Judge. Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Good afternoon. My name is Ryan Shelley Cabrera.
Where are you from, Ms. Cabrera?
I'm from Sacramento, California. I'm based out of there unless I'm working on a project.
What brings you to Midlands?
My career, I'm a writer. I do mostly biographies. I got my big break working with Random House on a book about the assistant to J.K. Rowling's assistant.
How did you first get into writing, Ms. Cabrera?
Well, it all started when I was in the second grade. I won my school's writing contest. And then fast forward a few years later, in high school, the only A I ever received was an AP English Language and Composition. So it seemed like a natural route to take from there.
How is it that you became involved in today's case?
Well, so after working with Random House, I was looking for my next big thing. So I took a poll of the 18 subscribers on my blog to see who they'd be most interested in reading about. And the clear winner by far and wide was Miss Agatha Lee, which is when I reached out to her.
Did Miss Lee respond when you reached out to her?
Yes, it took a while because, life gets busy and people are busy. So it took about 3 years for her to respond to me.
What'd she say?
She said yes.
Did you end up meeting with Miss Lee in person?
I did. So after she let me know and wrote back to me, I shifted to Midlands. I'm not sure if you ever heard of a method actor, but I see myself as a method writer. When I begin something new, I make sure to entirely immerse myself in lives of whomever I'm writing about.
How often did the two of you meet?
We met, I think, a few times every week, honestly. We became fast friends over our love of books and board games. My friends think I'm an old soul. At this point, I think arguing with them is a losing battle for clear reasons.
Now, where did you meet Miss Lee?
I'd mostly go to her house, but we would go to lunch sometimes. But her house, it was called Lee Manor, is on the outskirts of the town of Midlands.
While you were at Lee Manor, did you ever see Miss Lee interact with Drew Mars?
Yes, all the time. And if I hadn't thoroughly researched Miss Lee's genealogy before I got there, I would have thought that Drew was her grandson.
What made you think that?
Well, they just acted like family, and Drew even considered Agatha even considered Drew family. She told me that after she had passed, she'd be leaving everything to Drew.
When you visited, was there ever anyone else in the house?
Not at first, no, but I think in the last months of Agatha's life, her granddaughter Stevie came to live with her.
Did you know anything about Agatha's relationship with Stevie?
I did. So Agatha didn't have very much family, so we talked about Stevie quite a bit. And I appreciate how candid Agatha was because not all the people I write about are. She was basically sad that her and Stevie weren't closer. And This was a great angle for my book and all. I took up a whole chapter, but I was hoping secretly that they'd make up and have a happy ending.
Ms. Cabrera, I want to shift your attention a little bit. Did you see Agatha on August 14th?
I did. We had lunch plans, and Agatha picked a steakhouse to go to. So I had two concerns. One was that I'm a vegetarian, so a steakhouse wasn't my cup of tea. And the second was that the steakhouse was owned by the same person who was on trial for murder a few years ago. But Agatha picked it, and I thought, hey, what's the harm?
How did Agatha seem on that day?
Well, she was a little down and not her usual chipper self.
Do you know why?
Well, I'm no Miss Marple, but I'm guessing it was because she mentioned that she was worried that Stevie wouldn't forgive her for something.
Objection, Your Honor. Hearsay.
Response?
Your Honor, under Rule 8033, this is a statement of an emotional state. Miss Lee at the time said that she was worried Stevie wouldn't forgive her.
Mr. Weiberg, response.
Your Honor, the statement that she was worried is a statement of emotion, but the reason why she was worried, well, that's hearsay of a fact remembered. It does not fall under the exception 8033.
Your Honor, yes, Your Honor, this isn't about a fact remembered. This is her emotional state in that moment. Miss Cabrera testified that Miss Lee was down, not her usual self that day. She asked why, and Agatha mentioned because she was worried Stevie wouldn't forgive her. That is her mental or emotional state at that time.
May I respond to that?
You may.
While the statement that she was worried does fall under the Rule 8033, the reason that she was worried that Stevie wouldn't forgive her, well, that's trying to backdoor inadmissible hearsay in, and that should not be allowed onto the record and does not fall under the exception defined in 8033.
Okay, I will overrule the objection.
So, Ms. Cabrera, why was Miss Lee a little down that day?
She mentioned that she was worried because her granddaughter Stevie wouldn't forgive her for something.
Did she tell you what she was talking about?
No, we didn't get very much into it, but based on what I was seeing, it seemed like whatever happened didn't go very well between the two of them.
Objection, Your Honor, speculation.
Response.
Yes, Your Honor, this is a rationally based perception by the witness. She testified that Agatha Lee had seemed down that day, not her usual self. She testified to the statement that Agatha was worried Stevie wouldn't forgive her. And so she said that based on the conversation they had, it seemed like it hadn't gone over well.
Mr. Weiberg?
Your Honor, this witness is testifying to something that they did not observe. They only heard a couple statements about it. So therefore, for them to testify that it didn't go well, that's just beyond their rationally based perception.
So just to be clear, your objection is only to the statement that it didn't go well between the two of them?
Correct, Your Honor.
Okay. Mr. Rosati, any response?
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Cabrera just testified that her and Miss Lee had a conversation about that prior conversation. And now that based on what they said, Ms. Cabrera could tell that prior conversation seemed like it didn't go well. That's a rationally based perception by the witness based on how Miss Lee was acting, what she was saying, and what she was used to seeing Miss Lee do.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Yes.
This witness was not present for that conversation. They don't know exactly what was said. They don't know what Miss Rogers asked. They don't know what Miss Lee said. So therefore, for them to testify that this conversation didn't go well, that's beyond what they can rationally base on their perception and should not be allowed onto the record.
Okay. I will sustain the objection.
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Cabrera, did Miss Lee tell you what she was talking about?
No, not specifically.
And are you aware when Agatha Lee died?
I am. So after we had lunch, she went back, and then I learned later that she died sometime that night.
Thank you, Ms. Cabrera. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Okay. Cross-examination.
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Good afternoon, Ms. Cabrera.
Good afternoon, Mr. Weiberg.
Now, as much as I'd love to talk about your work, I want to start.
I would too.
I want to start by talking about that lunch you had with Agatha Lee.
Yeah, not my favorite, a steakhouse, but sure.
That was on August 14th?
Yes.
And as you guys were wrapping up this meal, you asked Miss Lee if she wanted to get lunch again.
Yes.
You suggested that Friday.
I did. We met a few times every week, and we hadn't met very much that week already.
And she said she had plans on Friday.
She did. I think so.
She told you that she was planning on meeting with her attorney.
Yes. So she had just told me about how, so for the first time
Objection, Your Honor,
in
to hearsay.
forever.
Response.
Your Honor, this is a statement of plan or intent, therefore it falls under the exception of hearsay defined in 8033.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
This isn't a statement of a plan. She said that she had plans on Friday. The way 8033 works is that if it's a statement that's a part of a plan, she had planned on doing something, she had an intent to do something, then it falls under that exception. Merely having plans in the future does not satisfy that exception.
May I be heard, Your Honor?
Real quick, Ms. Cabrera, could you tell me what the statement was again? Everyone kind of ended up talking over each other a little bit.
I believe it was she had plans to call her lawyer.
Okay. Yes, you may respond, Mr. Weiberg.
Your Honor, the witness just said that Agatha Lee told her she planned on meeting with her attorney. That falls under the exception defined in 8033. There doesn't have to be any written plan. It doesn't have to be something that they did actually follow through with. The statement just has to be a statement of intent. If she says she planned on doing something, that falls under the exception defined in 8033.
Mr. Zadi?
Your Honor, the way I understood the statement, it was that on Friday she was going to meet with her lawyer. That doesn't fall under the plan exception. It has to be part of a plan, not just something that she was going to do.
Okay. I will overrule the objection.
Ms. Cabrera, she told you she planned on meeting with her attorney on Friday.
Yes. So like I was saying, for the first time in forever, she told me that she had all these unpublished novels. So I was assuming it was about that.
But just to be clear, she didn't specify.
No, but that's what I picked up on.
All you knew is on the same week of August 14th, she planned on meeting with her attorney.
Yes.
Ms. Cabrera, I want to move forward and talk about some interactions you observed while you were at the Lee household.
Sure.
Now, you were writing a biography on Miss Lee.
Yes, I was almost finished at that point.
And while you were writing this, you often found yourself at the Lee household.
Yes. Like I was saying, I am a method writer, so a lot of my work happens at the place where the subject lives.
So you observed interactions between the people staying there.
I did.
You saw Mr. Mars.
I did.
You saw Miss Lee.
I did.
And you saw Miss Rogers.
Not as much, but yes.
Now I want to talk to you about an interaction you observed between Miss Lee and the defendant, Mr. Mars.
Sure.
Now, in May of 2020, you saw Mr. Mars administering medication to Miss Lee.
Yes.
And the defendant was describing what he was about to give to Miss Lee.
Yes, he was.
But she cut him off while he was describing it, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Because Miss Lee told the defendant, "You can skip the recitation. I'll take whatever you give me."
Objection to hearsay.
Response?
Your Honor, this is a statement that is, Your Honor, this is not going for the truth of the matter asserted, but the effect on the listener being Mr. Mars. He heard this statement, therefore he, if I may proffer,
You may.
he believed that, so once he heard that she would take anything you give him, he later followed through on this action on the night of August 14th when he went into the victim's room and switched the medication around. This is what the plaintiff is alleging. We're not using this for the truth of the matter asserted, just the effect on the listener.
What date was this statement made?
This was made in May of 2020.
Okay.
May I respond, Your Honor?
You may.
Your Honor, this statement has inherent truth value. For Miss Lee to say, "I will take whatever you give me," the plaintiff is using this to show that Miss Lee, in fact, would take whatever was given to her by the defendant.
Mr. Weiberg?
Your Honor, this is just going to the effect on the listener being Mr. Mars. He heard the victim say that she would take whatever he would give her. So therefore, on August 14th, he followed through with this action and switched around the medication. That is what the plaintiff is alleging.
Okay.
Your Honor, it's the plaintiff theories in today's case that the pills looked the same, so they switched out the pills and gave it to Miss Lee, and that Miss Lee took them. They're using the truth of this statement, that Miss Lee would, in fact, take whatever the defendant gave her in order to further their theory.
Okay. Overruled.
Your Honor, may we place a limiting instruction on that statement then for the jury if it's being not for the truth?
Absolutely. And I will also caution the plaintiff, counsel, both of you, I guess, because I don't remember who's closing, not to use this for the truth in closing argument.
I will make sure Ms. Goodchild's aware.
Thank you.
Ms. Cabrera, Miss Lee told Mr. Mars, you can skip the recitation. I'll take whatever you give me.
I think that's how that went, yes.
Now I want to move on and talk about why you're here in court today. Now it's true that in June of 2020, the defendant called you.
Yes, he did.
And Mr. Mars asked if you would testify on his behalf.
Yes, he did.
And you told Mr. Mars that you would testify.
Yes, I mean, I'd always observed them, and it was clear that Drew loved Agatha and Agatha loved Drew, so why not?
And that's why you're here today testifying.
Yes, for sure, and the pursuit of truth.
But in that exact same conversation in which you agreed to testify on the defendant's behalf, well, he asked you something else.
Yes, but the first thing he asked me about was the trial.
That's right. But then after he asked you to testify on his behalf, the defendant asked if you wanted anything from Miss Lee's estate.
Yes.
And you told him that you wanted Miss Lee's private book collection.
Yes, I mean, I loved Drew and all, and he seemed like a great person, but he just wasn't the bibliophile I was. I just wanted to make sure that all those books and writings Agatha Lee's were taken care of well.
Ms. Cabrara, let's talk about why you asked for these books in specific.
I couldn't wait to read them. I mean, there's no fan club of Agatha Lee's, but if there was, I'd be the president of it.
Well, Miss Lee, she had only published one novel.
Yes, Death in a Bottle. I'm sure you read it at some point.
I'm a big fan. But in this private collection, she had some of her other works.
Yes.
And these books were unpublished.
Yes, that's correct. They were unpublished.
And from what you thought, you were the only person that knew that she had these other books.
Yes.
Ms. Cabrera, these books, well, they were valuable to you.
Yes, I couldn't wait to get my hands on them and read them after so many years of not having any other works by Agatha Lee.
Ms. Cabrera, to you, you couldn't fathom how much these books could possibly be worth.
Oh, she's my favorite author, and the thought of having more works of hers to read was amazing.
Let's go back to that conversation you were having with the defendant. When you asked the defendant if he could have that private book collection, he told you, if I have these books after today's trial, they're all yours.
Yep.
So if the defendant wins this case today, you get all of Miss Lee's unpublished books, correct?
I think that's how that would work, yes.
Nothing further.
Any redirect?
Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Cabrera, Mr. Weiberg again just asked you about what you will be receiving from Mr. Mars.
Yep.
Was it your understanding that that was in exchange for anything?
No, I agreed to testify in this trial before he asked me that. And I knew that Drew couldn't have done it, just seeing how close him and Agatha were. So I'm just here wanting to testify.
Was that offer of those books contingent in any way on what your testimony is today?
No, not in the slightest.
Thank you, Ms. Cabrera. Nothing further.
Any recross based on that?
No, Your Honor, asked that Ms. Cabrera be excused.
All right, Ms. Cabrera, you may be excused. Are there any further witnesses from the defense?
No, Judge De Palma. With that, the defense rests its case in chief, and we're prepared to move into closings.
Okay, we are about to move into closing arguments. Before we do that, I would remind everyone to switch into speaker view up in the top right of your screen. And is the plaintiff ready to give their closing argument?
Yes, Your Honor, we are.
Okay, you can proceed.
Members of the jury. On August 14th of 2018, when Agatha Lee was getting ready for bed, she was happy. She'd finally had the chance to reconnect with her granddaughter. She was grateful for every day they spent together, every meal they could share, every game they could play, every last chance to say, I love you. And as Agatha went to bed that night, she was excited for whatever adventure they'd get up to in the morning. Sure, Stevie might not have been perfect, but she was family. But what Agatha Lee didn't know, what she couldn't have known, is that she wasn't going to wake up in the morning. Because the defendant had switched her medications for something deadly. Because he was out of time, and he was out of options. You see, it's the defendant's actions that bring us here today. Here in Midlands, there's a rule called the Slayer Statute. And what this rule establishes is that if somebody kills another person, well, they're not able to collect an inheritance from their victim. And that's the rule that governs this trial today. You see, the plaintiff, Stevie Rogers, has brought a claim of murder against the defendant, Drew Mars. And while this case isn't a criminal trial, today we have to answer one question. Who killed Agatha Lee? And in bringing this claim, we take on something called the burden of proof. Now, all that means for today's case is that we had to prove today that it's more likely than not that Drew Mars killed Agatha Lee. So let's go through today's trial to see how we've met that burden and to see how the defendant was out of time and out of options. Let's start with the reason Agatha Lee is dead. Money. Today you heard that Agatha Lee's estate was quite large, that in February of 2018, she changed her will to leave everything to the defendant. Now that was her home, her books, her bank accounts, nearly $20 million worth of inheritance. Something the defendant was desperate to get his hands on. Now, he didn't want this money just out of greed, but because he loved his family. Ladies and gentlemen, today you heard from the defendant himself that he knew he was running out of time, that he had spent years financially supporting his family, but his sibling was sick, and he didn't have the money to afford his treatments anymore. And he had hope that maybe if he could collect that inheritance, he could take care of his family. But then on August 14th of 2018, that inheritance was put at jeopardy. You heard today that he overheard a conversation between Agatha Lee and her granddaughter, in which Agatha promised that she was going to change her will, and that meant the defendant would get nothing. It meant he wouldn't be able to save his brother. The defendant was running out of time, and he knew he was running out of options, so he decided to do the unthinkable. Because when he was presented with the choice to save his brother or take care of Agatha Lee, picked family, put a plan into action. Members of the jury, you heard today that the defendant knew his plan would work, that he had spent years as Agatha Lee's nurse and knew that she had a deadly allergy to chlorandramine, something that he knew was the exact same size, shape, color as her arthritis medication. Something that he even said that if Agatha looked at a pill of chlorandramine, she wouldn't be able to tell that it wasn't her normal medication. Something he knew he could switch out for her medication and she'd have no idea. But what he also knew, that it was easy to get. The defendant told us today that around noon, after he heard Agatha and Stevie Rogers talking about her will in the study, he went to a pharmacy. And we know what he got. He picked up a bottle of chlorandramine, brought it back to the house, and then snuck into Agatha's bedroom and switched out those pills. Members of the jury, we know that's what happened on August 14th because the defendant left a trail. After they received a warrant, Mr. Bond and the Midlands police, they searched the entire Lee manor, and they found one bottle of chlorandramine hidden in the defendant's closet. Now, in a moment, you're going to get a chance to hear from the defense. And I'm sure they're going to come before you and try to tell you somehow that the defendant had been framed for some kind of fortune. But members of the jury, I want you to think about what that would mean. We know that the defendant wasn't framed, that this bottle of chlorandramine wasn't planted there by someone else, because the defendant's fingerprints were on it. This bottle was inside a bag that had one usable print of the defendant's. Not Miss Rogers, not anybody else. Why the defendant might have tried to tell you today that he would never bring this kind of medication into the house because he knew the danger of it. He left a fingerprint right on the container. We know he wasn't framed. He was caught because he was running out of time and running out of options. Members of the jury, when you go back to deliberate, it's your job to look at all of the evidence we presented today. And when you do that, I want you to think about what happened at the will reading. I want you to remember how during the cross-examination today, the defendant admitted that he lied. That after it was announced that he would receive the entire inheritance, he lied to the police for 2 reasons, ladies and gentlemen. The first reason he gave is because he didn't want the police to look into his motivations. And the second, because he never wanted to be investigated as a suspect. And there's a reason for that. Because when the police had the opportunity to actually investigate him, they found that he stood to gain $20 million if Agatha died. They would be able to find out that he needed this money for his family. And they would find that bottle of pills in his closet. The defendant was running out of time, and he was out of options. We ask that you hold the defendant accountable for his actions and find him liable. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Goodchild. Is the defense ready to give their closing argument?
We are, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Just a moment. Your Honor, counsel, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in a case like this one, when someone is accused of killing another person, what evidence would you expect to hear? You might expect to hear from an eyewitness, someone who actually saw the crime take place. You might expect to hear some connection between the murder weapon and the accused. You might expect to hear that nobody else could have done it. But that's not what you've heard today. Because Mr. Mars was framed for a fortune. Over and over today, we've heard Ms. Goodchild say, out of time, out of options, that Drew Mars killed Agatha Lee for the inheritance. But that doesn't add up. You see, the plaintiff's entire case revolves around Ms. Rogers' uncorroborated account of one conversation. Ms. Rogers will have you believe that on August 14th, just 1 month after moving back in with her grandmother, she was written back into the will. But Mr. Mars told us that conversation went differently than Ms. Rogers says. He told us that Ms. Rogers begged Ms. Lee to put her back into the will, but ultimately, Ms. Lee said no. So ladies and gentlemen, what do we do? With 2 conflicting accounts of one conversation, we have to look to the evidence. Ms. Rogers was out of her grandmother's life for 8 years, living off her $2 million trust fund. She was disinherited just 6 months earlier because she'd never had a job and she used her grandmother as her personal ATM. So does it make any sense that after just 1 month together, despite Ms. Rogers not holding a job, that Ms. Lee was suddenly okay with writing Ms. Rogers back into the will? Suddenly okay with Ms. Rogers using her as a personal ATM again? Of course not. What makes sense is Ms. Lee telling Ms. Rogers once again that the defendant needed to get back on her own 2 feet. But ladies and gentlemen, it's not just Mr. Mars telling us that's how the conversation went. It's also Ms. Cabrara. Just a few hours after that conversation, Ms. Lee told Ms. Cabrara that she was worried that Stevie would never forgive her. Now, the plaintiff will have you believe that because Ms. Lee called her lawyer to make an appointment, well, that's proof she was going to change the will. But if that's the case, where's that lawyer? Why doesn't the plaintiff want you to hear directly from that lawyer and tell you what the meeting was about. Because Miss Rogers isn't telling the truth. Members of the jury, without Miss Rogers' account of that conversation, the plaintiff's allegation is nothing more than that. The entire case just rests on speculation and the word of Miss Rogers. It's the plaintiff that carries the burden of proof today. They had to prove to you, by a preponderance of the evidence, that Miss Lee, Mr. Mars, was responsible for the death of Miss Lee. But they haven't been able to prove that to you. They haven't been able to prove to you that Mr. Mars knew that Miss Lee was even taking medication, or knew that Miss Lee's medication would be switched for chloroangiamine. They haven't even proven to you that Mr. Mars ever purchased that chloroangiamine. Because Mr. Mars was framed for a fortune. Let's take a look at the witnesses they called to try and prove it to you. We heard from Mr. Bond, the private detective. We didn't hear from Ryan Reeves, the person who conducted the forensic evidence. We didn't hear from Dr. Quincy, the person who conducted the autopsy. No, we heard from Mr. Bond, the detective for hire, who's being paid $25,000 by Miss Rogers to sell you her version of the facts. We also heard from Miss Rogers, who has $20 million, a $3 million house, and $2 million in royalties on the line in this trial. We heard Miss Rogers was desperate for money, that she'd never had a job, burned through a $2 million trust fund, and been removed from her grandmother's will. So Miss Rogers was out of options. She came up with a plan. She put her plan into action once Miss Lee refused to include her in the will one final time. And on cross-examination, Miss Rogers was forced to admit that she knew of her grandmother's fatal allergy to the chloroangiamine. So when Miss Rogers was home alone on August 14th, she switched her grandmother's medication for the chloroangiamine pills, knowing Mr. Mars would be the first suspect. She needed to be sure he'd go away for it. So she snuck into his room and planted the pills in his closet. But Miss Rogers wasn't done. She knew for her story to be believable, she'd need to create a motive for Mr. Mars to commit this crime. And what better way to do that than to create her own version of that earlier conversation, a version in which Mr. Mars is red in the face, fists clenched, and losing everything. Now, all she had to do was wait. The next morning, Miss Rogers tried to influence the police investigation as soon as it started. She immediately called her grandmother's death a murder. She blamed Mr. Mars right when the police arrived. She insisted that the police photograph the pill organizer. She insisted that the police run a toxicology screen. Ladies and gentlemen, she was so sure what that toxicology screen would show that she filed this lawsuit before we ever knew that her grandmother's death was anything other than natural causes. It's not a coincidence that Miss Rogers knew exactly which evidence the police would need to blame Mr. Mars. Mr. Mars was framed for a fortune. We're not here today because of the actions of Drew Mars. We're not here today because Agatha Lee randomly passed away one night in her sleep. We're here today because of a plan that Stevie Rogers crafted while her grandmother was still alive, a plan that would leave her $20 million richer. But Miss Rogers didn't plan for everything. Miss Rogers didn't plan for it to come to light that she knew of the Slayer statute prior to her grandmother's death. Miss Rogers didn't plan for Agatha Lee to tell Miss Cabrara about the conversation they'd had that day. But members of the jury, most importantly, Miss Rogers didn't plan for you. No, you can stop Miss Rogers' plan from working. You can be sure that Mr. Mars receives his full inheritance just as Miss Lee insisted on her final day alive. You can be the one to make sure that Drew Mars isn't framed for a fortune. Find Ms. Mars liable. Thank you.
Thank you. Any rebuttal from Ms. Goodchild?
Yes, Your Honor. If I may proceed.
You may.
Members of the jury, in this jurisdiction in Midlands, the defense isn't required to tell you what actually happened on the day in question. You see, that's the job of the plaintiff. But when the defense decides to tell you an alternate story, it's just as important when you go back to deliberate to look at how feasible that story is and look at that evidence as closely as you look at our evidence too. And I want to take a moment for you to consider what would have to be true in order for it to be that the defendant was somehow set up, for the defendant to have been framed. Members of the jury, you heard today that the police found a fingerprint of the defendant on the bag that contained pills of chloroandromine, on a bag that contained a deadly poison that the defendant told you today he knew that 2 pills of it would kill Agatha Lee. How do you plant a fingerprint? Members of the jury, it wasn't Stevie Rogers that found this bag, it was the police. It wasn't a frame. The defendant got caught. You see, what the defense is asking you to believe today is a whole lot of coincidences. That it was a coincidence that on August 14th, the defendant went to a pharmacy. A coincidence that he went to the pharmacy after hearing them talk about the will. A coincidence he had a bottle of pills in his closet. A coincidence there was a fingerprint on it. But members of the jury, when there's coincidence after coincidence after coincidence, well, it's just not a coincidence anymore. It becomes proof. Proof that the defendant killed Agatha Lee. Because he was out of time and he was out of options. Hold the defendant accountable for his actions. Find him liable.
Thank you, Ms. Goodchild. The case will be submitted to the jury.